Right, I got the sign for go, so let's go. Welcome to the Global Committee on Thought's lunchtime seminars. I hope everyone has something to eat and something to drink. My name is Staudinger. I'm one of the faculty members of the Committee on Global Thought, and I'm mainly based, however, in the Columbia Aging Center up on the medical campus. But the Columbia Aging Center is a university-wide center that works with colleagues all across the 4 Columbia campuses. So it's my great pleasure to have been asked to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Esteban Calvo, who also brings with him a very global connection, which actually today makes us not only a committee on global thought, but also a committee on global viewing. We are streaming this talk to Santiago de Chile, we hope, as long as the connection keeps up. So I'm welcoming any colleagues that are there in the Global Center at Santiago de Chile, which has been in a very active and fruitful collaboration with Esteban Calvo and the Columbia Aging Center. So we have a long tradition of collaboration. Welcome, and I hope you will be able to follow Dr. Calvo's talk. Professor Calvo very freshly has been called to be a full professor of public policy at the Universidad Mayor in Santiago de Chile, and to there run the rather newly founded Center on Public Policy Research of the same university. So we are very proud as the Columbia Aging Center to also have Professor Calvo affiliated as an adjunct professor in epidemiology and working with us at the Columbia Aging Center. And we have been successfully across multiple years been able to recruit funds from the PGIF fund here that the president has been offering for, I think, 4 or 5 years now to stimulate collaborations across the global centers and with Columbia faculty. Dr. Calvo is a life course sociologist by training, and he, after his bachelor's, which he did receive in Santiago de Chile, he went on to Boston University and received his PhD there in 2009, and then went on, as you can see, to obtain a Master of Science in Public Health, and this time from Harvard University. And from there, he was called back to his homeland for his first assistant professorship at the Catholic University in Santiago de Chile. However, he was very attractive to other universities, so only 2 years later he became associate professor at the University of Diego Portales at Santiago de Chile. And from there, the Universidad Mayor recruited him just this January to become a full professor. I think one of his major research areas for which he also has become very well known in the field of sociology is revolving around retirement, the retirement transition, and I think one of his, you may even call it citation classics, is a paper in the Journals of Gerontology where he was amongst the first ones to develop a theory-based and conceptually instructed testing of the effects of the timing of retirement on all sorts of outcomes. It's a very elegant paper. I recommend everyone to read it. And he followed up on this work with extending it to applying very sophisticated new methods in sociology that actually say it might be useful to move beyond one transition and look at sequences of transitions. So he applied sequence analysis, and this was another very successful paper that he just recently published in the Gerontologist. So that's a very nice outlet because it reaches a lot of the aging researchers community. And of course, he will tell us about other areas of his research, and today he is focusing on a much broader framework, which I'm sure he will be pursuing in his new role. His research has not only received peer review awards, he also received an award from the American Association of Public Health in 2013. It's the James G. Zimmer New Investigator Award of the section on aging and public health of the same association. And in 2016, I know it made him very proud, he received the Best Paper Award from the London School of Economics and their Center of Social Conflict and Social Cohesion. So you can tell his research is appreciated. Needless to say that apart from publicizing his work, he is also very successful in recruiting grants for his work. He has received multiple grants from the Chilean National Fund for Research and Development in Health, as well as the Chilean National Fund for Scientific and Technological Development. And before he returned to Chile, he was also very early in his career successful to receive funds from the United States Social Security Administration funneled through the Center for Retirement Research. He received 2 grants, quite sizable grants from them. So we are extremely pleased that you took the time during one of your multiple stays. He's coming multiple times during the year to be with the Columbia Aging Center, to take the time, be here with us with the Committee on Global Thoughts and share your thinking and ideas on this very ambitious title, From Cells to Society, Rethinking Public Policy in a Changing World. Dr. Calvo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and thank you for being here. Also my colleagues in Chile. Part of what I'm going to present today has to do with the new center, research center that I'm starting in Chile, and it also has to do with my career as a sociologist. I moved to epidemiology, and I've always sort of like came from the populations and trying to get inside of the body. That's sort of like where I'm going with my research. And I thought about this talk as an invitation to rethink public policy in a changing world, a world that is going through unprecedented demographic, epidemiological, technological, and also environmental changes. I'm not going to talk today about the environmental changes. I'm new to that area, so I don't think it would be a good idea to use my time on that. But it's a very important one that, together with these other 3 changes, are posing new challenges and raising issues on how we think and rethink public policies in this unprecedented reality. I think every public policy that we have in place today, everything that we have planned when we designed them, it's not going to be like that anymore. And we sort of know that, but really understanding these deeply and grasping all the implications is sort of like a work in progress. I've also thought about this talk as an opportunity to discuss the new role that public policy research must adopt in an area of big data, where we have unique opportunities of having surveys that have biomarkers and social questions, traditional questions in the same area, and to really conduct multi-level research that allows us to, well, propose innovative ideas or discuss things that we could have not discussed before these data were available. Now, I'm not going to do justice to all the areas of public policy that we can think. I'm going to concentrate in 2, so I'm going to grapple around issues around work, retirement, unemployment, so labor force policies, and if time allows, I'm also going to talk a little bit about substance abuse. So having said that, let me begin characterizing the global changes that I referred before, which I think are changing the landscape of public policy. So one of the most important ones is demographic change, right? So here you can see 2 pictures of the world. The top one is the world in 1950, and the bottom one in 2015. And what you're seeing here is life expectancy at birth, right? And you see the scale here. No data in gray, and then red is basically countries that have a very low life expectancy, around 20 years. On the far right, you see purple, which is up to 80, 85, right? So we're living longer than ever before. But every country is going through different processes. Some countries had lots of time to adjust to these processes, right? So they were able to think about these and to prepare themselves to enact policies that were answering to these questions, right? I don't think we ever anticipated living 20, 30 years in retirement, right? And that is happening today, right? And some countries saw that coming gradually. Some other countries went through such a quick and rapid change, they didn't have much time to think about these issues. Some of these countries didn't even have policies in place to address these issues, right? And as you can see here, these are historical timing again, and what you're seeing are the increases in life expectancy just to 4 countries to illustrate differences, right? So you have Norway and Denmark at the very top, and then you have Chile and South Korea here. And if you think about life expectancy at age 45, there is roughly 100 years between Norway, Denmark, and Chile, and South Korea. Now, these demographic changes also entail decreases in fertility, so the number of children born per woman also change. You can see in the top map data from 100 years ago, and then in the bottom map, 2015. Actually, those changes also happen with very different speeds across countries, right? And again, I selected a random number of countries to illustrate these. But the UK and the US, for example, have 95 years to see the change, the drop in fertility from 6 to 3 children per woman, right? Well, countries like China only had 11, right? So it's definitely a different speed in this change. Now, I guess the aging of individuals and populations can be very smooth if we manage to make those extra years healthier, right? And there are some changes in the diseases that we get. What do we die? So what are the causes of death? And when do we die, right? And data here are more recent. I can't go to 100 years ago. But I can compare, for example, 1990 with 2016, and this is the classic illustration of three types of diseases. You have non-communicable diseases in blue, then injuries in green, and then, and then in red, communicable diseases. And you can see that in the 90s, roughly half of the global causes of death were non-communicable diseases, right? Well, today, it's roughly 2/3, right? So the causes of death are also changing. And you can see this with more clarity, perhaps, in this graph. So if you divide the causes of death in 21 different groups and keep the same classification of NCDs and communicable diseases and injuries, you can see that the blue boxes, which are non-communicable diseases, either stay the same in the ranking or go up, right? While the other ones stay the same or go down. So those are striking changes. And again, they play out very different in different countries. So this is comparing 2 groups of countries. This SDI is a composite index of demographics and also income level and education. So we have low SDI and high SDI countries, and you can see their profile of diseases. Here you can see more colors, but whatever is closer to red is communicable diseases, closer to blue is non-communicable diseases, and to green is injuries, right? And you can see that if you look at 100% of deaths across these ages, at the bottom we have ages from 6 days to 95 years. I doubt you can read that, but it's the lifespan and the entire lifespan. You can see that at earlier ages, most of the deaths are related to communicable diseases, and that changes drastically across age. In both type of countries, they decrease a lot, but the decrease is very sharp in high SDI countries, right? In those countries, what you see playing out mostly at older ages are NCDs, right? And this picture is kind of misleading because if you really look at the rates of death, this is what's happening in these countries, right? So that's just to understand the composition of diseases, but these are the actual rates, right? So in high SDI countries, people are not dying in their infancy or very little, right? They tend to die at older ages, and they die mostly from chronic diseases. So we have demographic changes, we have epidemiological changes, and then we have technological changes that whatever you graph, you know, I just play out here with 3 indicators. So I look for data on supercomputer power, on gene sequencing, so the number of pairs of genes that you can sequence with $1, right? And how many transistors per chip you can have, right? And all of them grow kind of exponentially, right? And this has been described in multiple areas of technology. Every 2 years, the saying says that the number of these technologies tend to double, right? Now, technological changes are also related to work prospects, right? And one of the things that is probably going to change the landscape of public policies more drastically is that around half of the jobs that we know today are expected to disappear. That number changes from estimation to estimation, but clearly some jobs are disappearing. There are some tasks that can be automatized, some others that can be replaced by robots, right? So what I'm showing here, this is a graph that you can find in Bloomberg, and it's interactive, it's really nice. In the horizontal axis, you can see the risk of losing your job, right? And here you have the most vulnerable, and there at the left you have the least vulnerable. And these are the most likely to be automated, right? And then you have in the vertical axis the income level of these jobs. And then the colors are following the legend at the very top, which basically shows the level of education. And as you can see, for example, here you see a concentration of red bubbles, which are individuals with no formal education and higher risk of seeing their jobs automatized, right? And you can read different occupations, you know, I'm a sociologist and an epidemiologist, so I probably fall around here, you know. Payment is not that great, but likelihood of losing my job is not terrible. So all these changes are kind of interconnected. They're going to play out differently across countries, and they require us to rethink a number of areas in public policies. Now, as I anticipated, I'm going to focus on 2 different policy areas that require some innovative thinking and may benefit out of this new data availability. So one of the challenges is basically how do we address the aging of the population, the potential unemployment of robotization and automatization of jobs, and on top of that, Alzheimer's and other dementias, right? Is there any way we can connect these 2 issues, right? So far, we don't have any successful treatment for Alzheimer's disease, and the routes that we have been exploring to treat it have not been very successful in the results. So today, what we know is the greatest results that we can achieve are through prevention, either education or prevention of cardiovascular diseases, particularly strokes, that may explain a reduction, an historical reduction in the trends of Alzheimer's disease in some countries. Now, these 2 issues are far apart from each other. And typically in public policies, when you think about labor force, you go to the system and you think how the system is dealing with this. And when you think that the population is aging, well, people think about what should we do with our pension system and how to redesign it. And when you think about unemployment, they think about, well, what kind of unemployment insurance we need in place, right? And that research is relevant, right? So you can look at countries, for example, that are privatizing their pension systems. And there are a number. Chile happened to be the first one in 1981 that introduced individual retirement accounts that were fully funded and replaced the old age pay-as-you-go Social Security kind of system, right? Then a number of countries in Latin America and then later on in East Europe and Asia started to introduce similar kind of structural reforms. Many other countries introduced individual accounts without phasing out their social security system. So there was a diffusion of policies which we can look now at the country level because we have data. When these countries introduced these reforms, why they did it, with what level of depth, right? So we can take that data and create indices of the type of pension policies that these countries have in place. So the big debate here is, well, how much these systems redistribute income from people with high resources to low resources, and how much they redistribute risk from individuals to the collective, right? And sometimes these two dimensions get confused and lumped together. But fortunately, today we have cross-national data ranging from 1950 till today that we can use to see whether these two dimensions move together or they are independent from each other. And in this figure, basically, I use the presence of individual retirement accounts, the closure of the social security kind of system, whether the individual, the insured person, contributes more than 33% of the contributions to the individual retirement account system, because the employers and governments can contribute to. And also indicators on whether the country has any means-tested or universal kind of pension, non-contributory pension, whether the government funds pensions, and whether they systematically subsidizes pensions independently on whether they have any kind of government-provided pension. And they tend to cluster together in very separate groups, one indicating individualization and another one redistribution. Now, this data today we can link with what people are experiencing in their lives, right? So I took an example here, and this is a multi-level model where we're using this variation in pension policies across the world since 1980 until today to see how individuals are reacting emotionally to these changes, right? So individuals report their life satisfaction in a scale from 1 to 10, and on average, controlling by a number of individual level characteristics and country level characteristics, they are in a 6.45 level of life satisfaction from 1 to 10. Typically, they concentrate, nobody says 1, 2, 3, you know, it's too sad to say that. So you tend to concentrate in the higher end of the scale. And just by changing the policies, by combining, in this case, high redistribution with low individualization and high government support on top of that, you can create, or you observe a difference of more than 1 point in the scale in life satisfaction, which is a lot, you know. It's related, it's comparable to the experience of unemployment or to the experience of widowhood after some years, you know. So it's a very substantial change in this regard. So this is a way of going from country to the individuals and kind of like feeling their experiences. And there are other ways of doing that, you know, like with unemployment insurance. Today we have characteristics of the pension, of the systems, and how are they financed and how are they providing benefits, you know. And this is another example of showing how to link these two. We know that unemployed individuals suffer from unemployment, so again we have here a number of individuals reporting is like 200,000 individuals reporting life satisfaction. And here you have life satisfaction, for example, and the percentage of individual contributions out of their payroll. And you can see that if unemployment rates at the country level are low, there is very little effect. But if unemployment rates are high, contributing more to the system is associated with a higher life satisfaction, you know. So you could say that somehow individual contributions pay off, right? Now the individual share of contributions out of total contributions has a curvilinear return, you know, and you only see that increase at the very bottom end of the share. So a lot of burden to individuals that doesn't provide any additional benefit. Now this figure is presenting the information, but with country and employment rates in the horizontal axis. And what you're seeing there is that some government contribution is better for life satisfaction than having no contribution of the government to these pensions, right? So this is just an example to show how today we have enough detail and resolution on policy level information that allows us to say things beyond whether it's important to have or not an unemployment system in place. We could change life satisfaction for health, for female labor force participation, for whatever we want to explore, right? I just chose that because it was a way of showing how we can get sort of inside of the minds of individuals. Previous research has been very sort of like disappointing as far as having systems in place. Per se, most of these systems have very little effects, but it's the specific design, the configuration of these systems, what seems to matter. Now, when unemployment rates are low, the configuration of the unemployment system matters very little. I understand that, you know. But if we have a social problem, we have a policy problem, then the configuration of these systems have substantial associations with individual level variables. Now, with retirement, this is the timing of retirement. You can graph similar issues. So here in the horizontal axis, you have age of retirement. And the lines are comparing differences in predicted cognitive values for individuals that retired at that age with individuals that remained in the labor force, right? So if you have a line below 0, this is the United States, that line is below 0, that means that the retired individuals have lower cognition than those who remain in the labor force at this age, right? So retiring at age 50 is associated with lower cognitive score. And this is across a number of countries. And the patterns are more or less the same, but what comes out in all of these countries is that being retired at age 50 is associated with lower cognitive outcomes, right? Now, I'm not measuring the brain at this level, but we could potentially, and people have done that. And you could think, well, if people should remain employed, what kind of jobs should they have to hopefully see their cognitive functioning and brain preserved, right? In this context of aging and risk of dementia, that seems to be a very important factor in the design of these policies. And there is substantial research saying that complex job occupations are associated with cognitive functioning and regional brain matter, but complex jobs are not available for everybody, right? They are very reduced, and people with high education have complex jobs. And this is actually a paper by Ursula and colleagues where they find, they follow individuals in a assembly line. So these are workers that were followed for 17 years, and they measure how many work task changes they went through this period. So some of them had very stable tasks, and some of them went through multiple changes. And they measure performance in speed at the top and in memory at the bottom, and they also measure gray matter areas in the brain, and they see benefits associated with going through multiple changes. And this is something that could be extended beyond work, right? We see that too in volunteering. These are the experience corps. Now, I'm close of time, so I'm going to skip quickly to substance abuse to give you a few other examples. Today, we have comparable data for the first time in history. It's not that we had this data before. Cross-national research on substance abuse typically relied on administrative data, which was the only one comparable. But more and more, we're finding surveys that are using the same kind of questions to ask people how much they drink per day and how many drinks, so we can measure frequency and quantity of alcohol consumption in standard units that are comparable across countries. So these are, again, 21 countries where you see a harmonized measure of frequency of drinks per day and quantity of drinks in standard drinking units. So these are comparable. It doesn't matter if French drink wine or Russians drink, well, it does a little bit, but the alcohol concentration is comparable, right? So both vodka and alcohol wine will be comparable, right? And so it's very interesting to see these patterns. You know, you see countries that drink more frequently than quantity, right? So they drink all the time, but not too much, right? Take the case of France, for example, or Italy, you know. And you also see countries that drink lots of quantity, but not very frequently. Take the case of Poland, Chile as well, Mexico, right? So we find we were able to identify these patterns. These are aggregated, but these are individual level data, right? So we can model trajectories for all these individuals, and we can connect this data to a number of their individual level characteristics. And some of these surveys also have genetics, right? So we can use genetics to see whether they are explaining the patterns of consumption, whether they are explaining the health outcomes of these patterns of consumption, and whether they are explaining the policy effects of different measures that we take to regulate alcohol consumption, right? Like drinking age, or sales restrictions, or taxes, etc. This is another way of showing the same patterns, just classified in groups. You have heavy drinkers in black, moderate drinkers in dark gray, occasional drinkers in gray, then current abstainers in light gray, and lifetime abstainers in white, right? And you can see that there is a lot of variability across countries, and that is something very interesting to explain. We just started this project, and we're also seeing that there are important gender differences, right? And gender differences might be related to culture, but also to biology, right? So I guess the invitation that I'm bringing today, it's not all the answers, right? But the invitation that I'm bringing today is sort of like, think about policy with the same logic than precision medicine. We can move from precision medicine to precision policy. And specifically to this substance abuse example that I'm giving now, we have in these surveys, not in all of them, but in a few of them, we have genome-wide microarrays assays, including alcohol, metabolism, SNPs, right? So we have gene variants that we could use to understand differences in the way individuals metabolize alcohol, right? And that could explain why moderate alcohol consumption sometimes is found to be good and sometimes is found to be bad. Eventually, there is no safer dose for some individuals or for some countries, right? And we still don't really know that. And it's really hard to do that just doing one country by country study. Here we can compare bigger populations, make differences across groups, and see interactions between the moderate benefit of consumption and these genetic polymorphisms. We can also test, again, the policy effectiveness of regulating consumption in a number of ways. I see this as something very promising. I see this also as something generating a lot of skepticism and fear. And I share that, and I have questions about it, because none of us want the big brother looking at our genetics and connecting that to these other data sets where basically we're providing all of our information. So there are data protection issues to deal with, and countries vary. In Chile, for example, data is treated as a property. So you can basically sell your data. And a lot of people do that involuntarily, right? They go and sign online, and they get these genomics tests, and then they click on I accept the terms, and they basically sold or rented or leased their data, right? Their genetics data. And this is like very risky, right? So there's an important challenge in data protection, and also equality issues, I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to stay and say, well, I see a lot of potential in these ideas. I also think that, well, all the changes that I described, I think in our heads, we knew that they were coming, but we didn't fully grasp the implications of them for raising issues and questions about what will work and what won't as far as public policies. And these changes are going to continue for many years. And I guess we have a challenge of rethinking these public policies in connection to these changes and taking advantage of these new levels of data set that are readily available. We can expand today a lot to country level and get really fine-grained information on what is going with institutions. Historians have done an excellent work in creating these kind of data sets. And we can do the same going down from individuals to the biology to understand what is going there. And in those interactions between the biology, the individuals, and the context, I think lies a huge opportunity to rethink these public policies and connect things that otherwise would seem very distant from each other. Right? That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Calvo, for this tour d'horizon. I think it raises a lot of questions and comments, and we do have time to exchange some of our thoughts about it. Please, go ahead. In the back, please. Could you wait for a sec that our colleagues in Chile, there's a mic coming. Yeah. Thank you.
Interesting to see the data.
I think it's fine. It's.
Did present. You can hear that? No.
Well, we can hear you. It's mostly for. Yeah.
Okay, that you did present. What I'd be interested in from my own point of view, and perhaps the perspective of some of the individuals here, is if you have any data sets that would show the data, if people exercise, do they do something like, say, take vitamins and minerals, and do they maintain a low-calorie and high-fiber diet? Would you have data like that?
Yes, I mean, these 21 countries that I'm showing, this is just one example, you know. So these are data sets, panel data sets of individuals age 50 and over that with my group we began harmonizing like 5 years ago, but a lot of people started doing the same. And some of them did a better job than us. So now we use their work. So Rand Corporation, and I think now is in University of South Carolina, they harmonize the core values, core variables in these data sets, right? And then you have all these data sets which have tons of information. Some of them, like in the US, range from 1992 till today. And they have multiple core questions, then experimental modules. So you have the very classic information on physical activity and nutrition, but then every few years and now you have a group that is specifically interested in that, and you get like way more detail on those kind of measures. They're not always harmonized. Probably just physical activity will be harmonized. You know, nutrition, I doubt so. Right? But the information is available, and for each specific project, you can get those kind of behavioral variables.
Thank you.
Please, I had a question. Can you just move it over to the table? There's a question on this. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Are there examples currently of policies anywhere in the world that are trying to do this? In other words, trying to use the connections between genetics and social policy. And secondly, do you have an idea of what, you know, a kind of policy approach? I mean, I'm looking, for example, at the fourth item to regulate consumption. So what might a policy look like that uses the data that we have about the variation in risk, and what might a policy look like?
So I think there are more scholar articles than policies that go after these kind of things. So in substance abuse, you see a lot of how the effects of how the patterns of substance use and abuse depends on genetics, and how that interacts with the environment. How do the health effects also depend on genetics and interact with the environment to create some health outcomes. At the level of policies, I don't have any fresh examples, but I do envision potential areas. As a sociologist, I've always wanted to say something which is, there is a reality beyond biological determinism, right? I think the very least that we should do is to control for genetics, right? So then you get the real sort of like adjusted effect of the social variable that you're interested in. So that will be the first thing, you know, like just to estimating effects and understanding how much of that effect goes beyond the biology. But then I think a lot of these policies, the policy effects that we calculate when we evaluate policies can be exacerbated or moderated by genetic factors, right? And I think it's important to understand that too. It's part of our reality, is who we are as well. If for some reason we are creating a policy that on average has a beneficial effect, but it has a very detrimental effect on individuals that don't have a specific gene mutation, well, we should probably know about that, you know, and lay out specific recommendations for that group. If what we're finding is an average effect for the majority, but then there are multiple groups where this effect disappears or exacerbates, I think it's very valuable information. I mean, we don't just want to know average policy effects. We want to know the variation. And part of that variation can be due to genetics. Or we also want to know the effects of these policies, not just in fiscal sustainability, on individual decision making, but also in how they feel and how their body reacts and how these policies at the end become part of our body. I think that's the potential that I see. I mean, as a sociologist, I ended up thinking that we are individuals embedded in a social context, but we cannot forget about the body. We are also embodied.
Other comments, questions? Yes, please.
How has the experience in Chile worked out with the privatization of Social Security? And also, what about, I saw you had that chart about the other South American countries. Some have supplemented, some have abandoned. How has it worked out in the other South American countries?
Yeah, not as good as you hear abroad, you know. There was one candidate here that I'm not going to mention, but the slogan was, well, let's privatize Social Security to save it. And the main example was, let's look at how good this play out in Chile. And well, some aspects worked, but overall, there are major difficulties. So replacement rates of those pensions are really low. The gender inequalities and also SES inequalities in the benefits received increased compared to the past. So Chile actually ended up backing off some of these reforms. And the recent reforms have been strengthening the public components of the pension system and not sort of like reenacting a social security system, because it's not also that it's like a silver bullet, but definitely, well, fixing the issues in the private system that were not working, very little competition among pension fund providers. So they were charging tremendous fees to individuals, using a lot of that money for marketing or things that you could be avoiding, right? And the recent reforms have been basically tailored to increase equality in the benefits and to provide minimum security to lower income workers and minimum guaranteed benefits and so on. Now, as I suggested to move down with the policy explanation, I think we should also take advantage of these cross-national data sets that now are available, because within a single country, we see very little policy variation. The state is kind of particular because you have states, right? So you see more variation than in many other countries. But in countries that are fully federal, that they don't have any states, you have one policy change every decade, you know? So it's really hard to take lessons. And by being able to observe variability in policies across countries and over time, you can learn a lot. And I think with pensions, Chile is not the only country that has done this. And some other countries have done it. And these kind of pensions work better in countries that have a more rational mindset. So not long ago, we were doing rituals in the production of wealth, like we will harvest things and think that a third of that we owe it to the deities, to the god or whatever, and we will just consume that in a big party, which was not very rational, you know. So the origin of wealth was attributed to some deity. So this idea of saving your money in an individual retirement account wasn't part of the culture. And people were not saving in individual retirement accounts. They wanted to buy a house for the collective, for their children. So collective ways of saving were preferred than these individual retirement accounts. In other countries, it connects better with the cultural values, I believe. And some countries that have very corrupt systems have also failed majorly, like Argentina. They have a bunch of private pension funds. As soon as the government was lacking money, basically they reenacted a public pension system which was borrowing money from these funds, you know, to pay the current deficit.
Please, did you get the microphone? Yeah. Great.
Thank you. There were very interesting charts also on cognitive function and age of retirement. And of course, there's a strong gender dimension, even in the countries that
Yes.
you were showing. And can we say anything about it, or what are the implications?
Yeah.
Of
So the first thing that I would say is, I use it sort of like to show an example, but I wouldn't trust these results to be causal in any way. The timing of retirement can be due to changes in cognition. So there are some research, and there are some studies that address that. In this slide that I show, it's not. So I'm just like plotting individuals, like I'm just doing fixed effects across individuals, and that's it. But I would say if you look at the bulk of research, what you find is that retirements that are involuntary and happen too early tend to be detrimental to a variety of health outcomes, including cognition, mostly to subjective outcomes like subjective health, self-reported health, or depressive symptomatology and whatsoever. Now, there is a lot of variation across individuals, and that variation is explained by the type of occupation, you know. So we hear in the US that one of the things, well, most of the studies that are conducted in the US end up concluding that work is, by and large, a good thing, you know. That might not be true in China, where occupational safety and hazards are still a major issue, right? So I've always dreamt with something that I haven't found, but I think will be very useful for this debate, is just finding a cross-national data set showing work injuries for older adults. Because all this debate about keeping older adults working longer, well, it's really a different conclusion if you see that people are losing limbs and dying in some countries and not in others. And I expect for it to be a lot of variation in this kind of occupational safety issues. Now, if you stay in your job, what we know is like not all jobs are equally safe or equally stimulating, and I think Ursula can add to that because novelty processing. Do you want to say something about that? It's very interesting.
Novelty
processing? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not connected only with paid work. It can also happen in leisure time activities or any other kind of activities you're choosing for yourself. But we found in our work, which Dr. Calvo was kind enough to cite, that if we follow individuals across time and we are able to record how many novel tasks they have to perform on their job across a time window of 17 years at a very low complex job. So in principle, their mental stimulation is low. But some of the workers had more stimulation because they had to do new tasks on the assembly line and others didn't. And we were able to control for voluntariness of that dimension. You can show that it has massive impact on the structures in our brain and at the behavioral level on their capacity for cognitive functioning. And it's such a simple thing that we could change so easily, you know, if being aware of it and trying to make it possible. But I don't know whether I heard you correctly before. You were talking about gender differences. So it's an interesting question you ask, and I would say stay tuned, because the committee asked me to present a study that we did exactly on that. And so I don't want to give away the punchline of that. So please come back.
And I think one point that Ursula brought up is that you can get similar benefits from leisure, right? So if you have post-retirement activities that are stimulating enough, you can compensate a lot of what you're losing from your job, right? Usually, the quality of those activities is related to your education level. And for example, in Mexico, we use that as a case study with Kasim, who's sitting here. It's an interesting case study because a lot of those older adults have very little or no formal education. So we can compare a substantial group of individuals that have no or little education with individuals that have some degree of education, right? And those that have some degree of education go through the retirement transition in a much easier way and see no or less decline in the outcomes, health outcomes that we look at. While the individuals that had very little education had definitely worse health outcomes. So it's the quality of the activities and also the resources. Not all the countries allow you to transit into retirement with the same amount of resources. Usually there is a decrease in resources, but how sharp it is it varies a lot from one country to another. And regarding gender differences, I also think that the answer depends on the culture. Because in some countries, women have very little labor force participation, and those few that you see retiring, maybe at the end they are conforming to that cultural value, So I think that situation is very different from a retirement transition of a woman who's working in a country that was fully supportive of her career, right? I'm not sure in which directions the effects will go. But I definitely see big differences. Also in caregiving. If you're going to retire and end up caring for all your family, it's very different than if you're going to retire and, I don't know, like go to a second honeymoon or something like that, right?
Other comments, other questions? Doesn't seem to be the case. So thank you very much, Dr. Calvo, also for the discussion.